Welcome to another tutor short provided by the Educational Support Services Department of Lehigh Carbon Community College, which is in Schnecksville, Pennsylvania, just outside of Allentown. These videos review key learnings from our science courses here at LTRI-C, and please remember that the Educational Support Services Department does provide walk-in tutoring. This video is going to review Newton's first law, which states that every object continues in its state of rest or of uniform velocity in a straight line as long as no net force acts upon it. And it's commonly represented by this equation here: the sum of forces equals 0. So let's look first at the state of rest. I've depicted here a rock sitting on the ground, and it's generally obvious to think as long as nobody acts upon that rock, the rock is just going to sit there. Now you need to realize that even though the rock is standing still here, there are forces upon it. Obviously there's a force of gravity acting on it that's trying to push it down, and the ground is having a force up to hold that rock in place. And those two forces cancel each other out. If there's a wind, say coming from one direction, say from this side over here, then if the rock's not moving, there must be a friction force in the opposite direction, that the friction along the ground is holding it in place, and it has to be an equal force to the wind force on the other side. So the rock sitting there has an overall net force of 0. All the forces are balancing out, and the rock is not moving. Now, if we're to apply a force on the right that overcame, say, all the forces of friction, say, or wind on the other side, and it was in excess of those resisting forces, then the rock would move, and that movement would not be part of Newton's first law. You would then enter into Newton's second law, which we'll do in another video. So that's where we stand when we look at objects at rest. Let's now look at the second part of Newton's first law, and that's where we're traveling at a uniform velocity in a straight line. And so I use here as an example a car traveling on a road. And as I say here in the text, let's say we're moving at a constant velocity of 10 miles per hour. So that's that uniform velocity. We're going in a straight line at 10 miles per hour. In order for the car to do that, the overall forces acting on that car must equal 0. And there are forces acting on this car. The tires have friction being applied on it on the road. So there's a friction force trying to slow the car down. There's also the force of the atmosphere, either through wind or just the idea of pushing aside the atmosphere as the car is traveling forward. Those resistances have to be equally opposed in order for the car to maintain a uniform velocity. And the way the car does that is with its engine. It has gasoline, the engine is running, you have your foot on the accelerator, and you're keeping a nice steady pace of 10 miles per hour. If you're keeping that uniform velocity, then you're exactly canceling out the air and friction forces that are applying on that car. So that's uniform velocity. Now, it's important to remember that it's also related to the direction, a straight line. If there's a cross breeze here, say, that's trying to push the car to the left or to the right, those also have to be opposed. If not, then the car is going to veer to the left or to the right, and when it does that, now you're outside of the first law. So to maintain the aspect of the first law, all the forces that are acting on that vehicle have to be balanced out. In the case of a cross breeze, you would turn the steering wheel so that it's the engine is helping you maintain a straight line action on that. Let's now look at a problem that entails both parts of Newton's first law. So I show here a car sitting at rest for 10 minutes, and then the car accelerates up to 60 miles per hour over the next 10 minutes. And then once it reaches 60 miles per hour, it maintains that speed at 60. And so the first part of the problem, essentially the first 10 minutes, the car is at rest. And so we're under the first part of Newton's law that we talked about. The sum of the forces is equal to 0 at that point. And the forces on that car are not very significant, but the weight of the car is pushing down, the ground is pushing up equally. And if there's any wind involved, then the car is standing still either because of friction forces or because you have your foot on the brake. And all the forces are equal to 0, and the car is standing still. But then when you accelerate the car for the second half here, now we're accelerating. In order to accelerate, the forces can't be equal to 0 now. Some force must exceed all the other forces so that the car can start to build speed up. So now, under Newton's second law, the sum of the forces is equal to the mass times the acceleration that's occurring. And so the first law does not apply for those 10 minutes. But once we reach our 60 miles per hour, we said we now maintain that speed at 60 miles per hour. So now we're back into the first law. We're keeping our speed at 60. We're pressing down on the accelerator just enough to overcome any friction or wind resistance on that car and keeping our speed constant at 60 miles per hour. So we are now under that second part of the Newton's first law. So if you're given a problem like this, the way you would tackle it is you would break it into 3 parts. And then during the first part, you would use the sum of forces equal to 0 to resolve your forces on the car. During the second part, in order to identify forces, you would set that equal to mass times the acceleration, and you could resolve the unknowns that you have during that period. But then once you hit your 60 miles per hour and you're back into a uniform velocity situation, now you're going to use Newton's first law equations, where your sum of your forces equal to 0 to resolve any unknowns you have at that part. So you would break this problem into 3 different sections and apply the appropriate law for each of those sections. Thank you.